So in this case, we retained the UDS3 battery and supplemented it. And we also needed the remote capacity. So we are definitely retaining the TCOG as well, and the VCOG for video, and focusing though on the in-clinic assessment with the UDS3 battery supplemented in several ways. One is the addition of standardized word list verbal learning measures. And as you may recall from previous presentations, we surveyed the centers and looked at what centers were already doing, and almost every center was doing some type of verbal learning test. There were about 5 or 6, but the Ray auditory verbal learning test and the Seriad word list were the 2 most frequent and are widely employed. There's tremendous data on both. Both have been translated into other languages. And we decided to maintain a choice of one of those 2 options. So all centers are asked to select one of these measures. The Ray AVLT takes probably about 5 minutes longer, and it has it's a 15-item word learning list over 5 trials. Because there are 75 items in total learning, it's more sensitive, but it does take a longer time. The Seriad word list, widely used in clinics, is shorter, 10 items, 3 repeats instead of 5. And it may be less sensitive, but also good for later stages of dementia. So we're asking centers to choose one or the other and add that to the battery. Another innovation, while we didn't move to novel digitized tests or digital formats at this stage, we did decide to strongly recommend the capture of the speech data during the cognitive battery. Now, there are a lot of issues still to work out, but if each site uses digital recording for the entire cognitive battery, the data can then be stored locally. There are issues in terms of technology, both IT, privacy, IRB issues, and storage of large amounts of data over time. These are being worked on now. And what we are asking sites to do is to store their data locally with the idea of being able to have it de-identified and ultimately shared with NACC. So there'll be more on this in the future. There is a digital recording guidance document, and we'll make sure that the link is provided for that document. Thanks to Rhoda O and her team at BU and Hannah Kraft at Indiana and others that all worked on that document, which is available now. Another consideration that came up was how practice effects would be dealt with. Should we have alternate forms for many of the tests or just try to model practice effects? And in the end, after a considerable discussion, polling the members and a lot of input from several statisticians, we decided that most of the forms, there weren't alternate forms for everything, and they're imperfect, and that it would be better to model the practice effects. So that was ultimately the decision. So the forms stay the same, and practice effects are modeled for longitudinal purposes. There's a lot of discussion about the future, digital technologies, digital tests. One of the next items for consideration is the inclusion of digital pen capture data and piloting some digital measures, but those are future developments. And for now, it's the UDS plus digital recording and the choice of one of the 2 verbal learning measures. And with that overview, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Barnes, who's going to walk you through the new tests and forms. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Andy. I'm just going to make it a bit more concrete. Andy gave a really comprehensive background about the battery. So this is the top part of Form C2. And just like all the other forms, we ask that you record the testing language and whether it was in person or remote. And if remote, please give the reason using the codes in the box there. So this is the test order for in-person and video recording. We also show the approximate administration time for each test. So everything in black font is the same as UDS3. And as Andy indicated, we only added the 2 verbal list learning tests that's shown in red. And every center is required to do one of the 2, either the RAE or the CIRAD. The test order was changed just very slightly from UDSv4 to accommodate the verbal learning tasks and to reduce interference. So you can see we start with the MOCA, and then you can see the rest of the tests listed there. The verbal learning test immediate, either the RAE or the CIRAD, and the verbal learning takes about 7 minutes. CIRAD takes about 3 minutes to administer. And then in the interim, during the delay period, you can fill that time with additional tests, maybe at your local centers or questionnaires that do not interfere with recall. So for example, you could do the GDS during that period. And then after the delay, you do the verbal learning delayed and recognition tests, and that will take about 2 minutes. And then you end with the MINT. So just to get into the forms specifically, you would indicate which tests you're doing and go to that appropriate page if you're doing the RAE or the CIRAD. So for the RAE, as Andy mentioned, there's a list of 15 words, list A, that's read aloud for 5 consecutive trials, and each trial is followed by a free recall test. After the 5th trial, an interference list of 15 different words, so list B, is presented, followed by a free recall test of that list. Then the participants are required to recall all of the words that they can remember from the first list A. So this is the response form. So be sure to record the number of correctly recalled words and the number of intrusions at the bottom of the form. So the intrusions are, of course, the words that were not on the list. You do this for all 5 trials of list A. You do it for list B, the interference trial, and then you do it for trial 6 of list A. The delay period for the RAE is between 20 to 30 minutes, but you do not cue the participant that they will be asked to remember these words later. So after the delay of 20 to 30 minutes, you should fill the time with additional tests or tasks that don't involve verbal encoding, and then ask the participant to recall all the words that they can from the list that was read several times. Please note the order of recall for correct responses and enter the number of intrusions at the bottom of the form. There's also a recognition test for the RAE, and there are 2 different formats. So at the top, please indicate which format you use. So the format shown here is to be used if the participant cannot read or has some type of visual impairment. In this case, the examiner reads each word on the list. You don't show the participant this list, you just read it to them one at a time, and the participant is to say yes or no as to whether the word was on the first list. And then you record the total correct and the total false positives. This is the format that is most commonly used according to the survey that we got back from the centers. And you would place this list in front of the participant and have them circle all the words from the first list. This is the other option for the verbal list learning, is the CIRAD word list task. And for this test, the participant reads 10 words presented one at a time in a booklet, and is then immediately asked to recall the words after each trial. So there's 3 learning trials. So for each trial, record the number of words recalled correctly, the number of intrusions, and if the participant can't read a word or they mispronounce a word, you are to record the number of word failures under can't read on the side there. The delay interval for this test is 5 minutes and should be filled with a task or test that is nonverbal. If the person cannot read at all or has visual impairment, an alternative way to give this test is to read each word out loud to the participant and have them repeat the word after you. Again, there are 3 learning trials. The other option for verbal list learning is the CIRAD, after 5 minutes, you ask the participant to recall as many words from the list as they can, and you record the total recalled and the number of intrusions. For recognition, you will show a list of words. Some are from the learned list and some are not. The participant is to respond yes or no if the word was from the list that they learned. Again, if there's visual impairment or they cannot read, you can read each word and have them respond yes or no if the word was on the list. So as Andy said, a much easier test and probably really appropriate for more advanced cases of dementia. So this is the last slide. If you are doing a telephone cog, there are 2 versions listed here, depending on which verbal list learning test you give. So the box on the left is for centers who use the RAY. The tests in green are the required tests. So for those centers doing the RAY, you'll administer the MOCA blind, the craft story immediate, number span, and then you'll do the RAY immediate. Then you can do category fluency, the craft story, and verbal fluency. And if you still need more time, you can do additional tests or tasks that don't interfere with recall. And then you do the delayed RAY. And then you end with, oh, sorry, no, you don't end with the verbal. That's optional. The box on the right is for if you're doing the CIRAD. It's the same order of tests, except for, the CIRAD has a shorter delay. So during the delay period, you would just include, you could probably include category fluency. And I did that wrong. So first you start with the MOCA, the craft, and the number span. Those are required. And then you do the CIRAD wordless learning, followed by category fluency. And then you do the recall, craft story, delayed, and verbal fluency. The tests in yellow are optional. And, you might also have some local tests you do at your center. We would like for you to do those yellow tests, but they are not required. And I think that's it. So happy to take questions.
Thanks, Lisa. And I think it's good to emphasize that while we realize, especially during and post-COVID, that having remote assessment capability is a very important resource. In fact, the whole clinical task force pivoted to developing remote assessment just as we were starting to work on UDSv4 at the time. But the real preference is to have people come in. We just heard a lot about the neurologic exam and other things that, including you can't do biomarker collection, MRIs, PET scans, and so on over the phone or even by Zoom. So it is really important for people to come into the centers and to do the standardized assessment whenever possible. But at least we have these options as a backup. It's also worth mentioning that there's a trial going on led by Bonnie Sachs, Suzanne Kraft, Steve Rapp at Wake, but involving many of our centers that are directly comparing the in-clinic battery to the VCOG or TCOG. It's primarily shifted to video as the main focus. So there will be data on the relationship of those assessments forthcoming. But in the interim, we basically have the forms for the in-clinic UDSv4 battery and then the VCOG and TCOG. And it's probably obvious, but the reason for the TCOG is So, for people really just having a telephone-based assessment, they can't do anything visual, so that all of the stimuli would have to be administered verbally. And that form is set up and available and has been. Otherwise, we really recommend the in-clinic and VCOG if it is remote. And we can take questions.
Some questions in the chat, Andy.
Yeah, right. So I think I'm at the top. The GDS likely won't be enough to fill the delay. That's probably true. And we also recognize centers have some of their own unique center-specific tests and methods. The principle really is to avoid direct interference as much as possible. So I think another question was, what about administering the MINT as a verbal naming test, during the verbal memory delay? And we would prefer to not have tests in the same domain that would potentially interfere. But again, there may be site-specific issues or constraints. So rather than this being an absolute, it's really guidance in terms of what we think would be a best practice. But there may be site-specific issues. And I think, let's see. Right, we're right advising against using verbal tasks during the delays, especially ones involving any kind of verbal retrieval.
And Andy, if you are reading a question, would you mind reading it aloud just for the recording purposes?
Oh, sure. Thank you for that reminder. The order shown at the end had verbal fluency during the delay. Oh, could you clarify that? I think we're really advising not to put the verbal fluency during the delay because it does involve verbal retrieval mechanisms. So we'll get a correction on that.
Yeah, sorry about that. I pulled the latest notes and maybe that wasn't the last conversation.
We did have a lot of versions of this. Are there other questions in there that we missed?
Will the database allow us to enter either of the new tests? We use the HVLT in our visits, just brainstorming how to reduce duplicating tests.
Right. Well, the HVLT is one of the other tests in use at some of the centers. The CIRAD and the RAY were the most frequent, and in the end, we decided not to try to have 5 or 7 different tests, but to limit it to 2 that were the most frequently used. So one of the 2 is a requirement for UDSv4. That's not to say that centers that do the HVLT or California Verbal Learning Test or another test couldn't do that, but it would be advisable to do it during a different visit if that's possible. If people are coming in for imaging or coming back for some other reason, rather than trying to do it during the same exam. And there are UDSv4 forms for both the CIRAD and the RAY that Lisa just showed you. So those exist. And presumably there'll be red cap versions of those as well, but perhaps the NACC folks can comment on that. For a question regarding the TCOG says to put the verbal fluency in the RAVLT delay, but the in-person says not to. I think I would say if you're doing the TCOG, follow the written TCOG instructions. But we are advising going forward not to have verbal material, especially involving retrieval during the verbal delay, and to use some other material if at all possible.
I think we have time for one more question before we should pivot.
I think most of the questions involved order of administration and also material that could be used in the delay. So we will make sure and have clear guidance on those issues. Thank you all for raising those points.
Thank you all.